The air in the Barlow saloon is thick with the smell of stale beer, sweat, and cheap tobacco. It hangs in the yellow lamplight like a shroud. Silas Croft, a man whose prosperity has only widened his streak of cruelty, leans back in his chair, his thumbs hooked in his vest. His eyes, small and hard as river stones, are fixed on Jedediah Stone. Croft's laughter is a wet, ugly sound that makes the other men at the table snicker along with him. Jedediah just stares into his half-empty glass of whiskey, the amber liquid a poor substitute for warmth. He'd come to town for salt and flour, not for this. Not to be the target of Croft's afternoon sport. Look at him, boys, Croft sneers, gesturing with his cigar. Jedediah the Just. Too good to drink with us, too poor to buy a round. Bet that ranch of his is nothing but dust and sorrow. What you need, Stone, is a wife. Someone to warm that empty bed of yours. Jedediah's jaw tightens. He says nothing. Engaging Croft is like wrestling a pig in mud. You both get dirty, and the pig likes it. Then, the saloon doors swing open, and the town's attention shifts. Mr. Abernathy, the merchant, steps in, followed by a small, slight figure. A Chinese woman, her head bowed, her hands bound loosely in front of her. She wears simple, dark trousers and a tunic, her black hair pulled into a severe braid. Her face, when she briefly lifts her chin, is a mask of weary resignation. She's chattel, another piece of property to be traded. Abernathy had won her bond in a poker game from a railroad foreman. Croft's grin widens. Well, speak of the devil. Abernathy, what's this you've got? Looking to offload some of your winnings. Abernathy, a nervous man who lives in Croft's shadow, nods eagerly. Her bond is for 2 more years. A good worker, I'm told. Quiet. I've no use for her at the store. Thought I'd see if anyone here was in need of household help. The men eye her like a piece of livestock. Their gazes are heavy, invasive. The woman flinches but remains silent, her focus on a scuff mark on the floorboards. It is in that small, almost imperceptible movement that Jedediah feels a familiar, unwelcome spark of something hot and protective in his chest. It's the same feeling he gets when he sees a coyote corner a lamb. Croft seizes the opportunity, his eyes gleaming with malicious inspiration. He turns his gaze back to Jedediah. Here's your chance, Stone. You're always so righteous. Why not take her? Too good for a woman like that. Leave it, Croft, Jedediah says, his voice a low rumble. What's the matter? Can't afford her. Croft laughs, a cruel bark. Tell you what, I'll buy her bond for you. A wedding present, the men roar with laughter. The humiliation is a physical thing, pressing in on Jedediah from all sides. We'll even have the preacher say some words. Mocked into a wedding. Jedediah Stone, married to a Chinese bondswoman. It's perfect. The woman looks up then, her dark eyes meeting Jedediah's for a fleeting second. He sees not fear, but a profound, bottomless exhaustion. He sees a human being trapped in a cage of public amusement. The laughter of the men, the woman's silent suffering, Croft's smug face. It all coalesces into a single, sharp point of decision inside him. He could walk away. He could endure the taunts and ride back to his empty ranch. Or he could do the one thing they didn't expect. He stands up, the legs of his chair scraping against the floor. The saloon falls quiet. He pulls the few crumpled bills from his pocket and slaps them on the table. It's not enough for the flour and salt, but it's all he has. He looks at Abernathy, ignoring Croft completely. Her bond, Jedediah says, his voice clear and steady in the sudden silence. I'll take it. Croft's jaw drops. Abernathy looks stunned. The other men just stare. But Croft recovers quickly, his sneer returning. Just buying her ain't enough, Stone. We all heard the offer. A wedding. Or are you a coward on top of everything else? Jedediah holds the woman's gaze. He sees a flicker of something in their depths, not hope, but a question. He gives her a nearly imperceptible nod, a promise he isn't even sure he can keep. He turns back to the grinning fool who held all the power in this town. Fine, he says, the word costing him everything and nothing at all. We'll be married. They faced harsh judgment, but someone saw their true value. Before this story unfolds, tell us, have you ever stood up for someone unfairly judged? If you believe in looking beyond the surface, hit like and subscribe. The laughter that erupted was louder and more vicious than before, but Jedediah didn't hear it. He was looking at the woman who was now, by some twisted act of defiance, his responsibility. Her hands were still bound, and with a surge of cold fury, he walked over, pulled a knife from his belt, and sliced through the rope. The two halves fell to the floor. His life, and hers, were irrevocably changed. The ride out of Redemption Gulch was a silent ordeal. Jedediah Stone led his aging horse, Bess, with the woman walking a few paces behind him. He hadn't asked her name. He hadn't said a word since leaving the saloon, where a drunken, laughing Judge Peterson had scribbled out a marriage certificate in exchange for the promise of a bottle of whiskey. The whole town had treated it as a grand joke, a play put on for their entertainment. Silas Croft had been the gleeful director, slapping Jedediah on the back with a familiarity that felt like a brand. Jedediah's ranch was a good 5 miles out, nestled in a small valley that was more rock than soil. It had been his father's, and his father's before him. They'd all been stubborn men, content to wrestle a living from the ungenerous land rather than bow to anyone. Jedediah had inherited the stubbornness, but not the contentment. Loneliness was a constant, silent companion, a weight that settled heavier in the quiet hours after sunset. He was 34 years old, with calloused hands, a sun-weathered face, and a disposition that tended toward silence. He wasn't a man built for company, and he certainly wasn't a man built for a wife, especially one acquired in a saloon as a punchline. He risked a glance back at her. She walked with a steady, enduring pace, her eyes on the dusty trail. She hadn't complained, hadn't cried out, hadn't made a sound. She was small, but not as fragile as she'd appeared in the dim light of the saloon. There was a wiry strength to her, a resilience in the set of her shoulders. He felt a pang of guilt sharp enough to be a physical pain. He had involved her in his own foolish pride. He hadn't saved her, he'd just traded her cage. Now she was bound to him, a man she didn't know, heading to a life she couldn't imagine. The sun was beginning its slow descent, painting the western sky in brutal strokes of orange and purple. The air grew cooler. He noticed she was shivering slightly in her thin tunic. Without a word, he untied the worn wool blanket from his saddle roll and held it out to her. She stopped, her eyes wide with caution, as if expecting a blow. He saw the flicker of old fear, and it angered him, not at her, but at the world that had put it there. He gentled his movements, placing the blanket around her shoulders. Her hands came up to clutch it, her fingers small and delicate against the rough fabric. She gave him a short, jerky bow of her head, a gesture of submission that he didn't want. He just grunted in response and turned back to the trail, his own cheeks burning with a strange mix of shame and frustration. They arrived as the last light bled from the sky. The ranch wasn't much. A small, sturdy cabin made of hand-hewn logs, a leaning barn, a corral holding his only other companion, Bess, and a few chickens scratching in the dirt. A vegetable garden fought a losing battle against the dry soil near the cabin. To Jedediah, it was home. He wondered what it looked like to her. Bleak, most likely. Isolated. Another prison. He led the horse to the trough, uncinched the saddle, and began rubbing her down. The familiar ritual calmed his frayed nerves. The woman stood by the cabin door, a small, still shadow in the twilight, clutching the blanket around herself. She was waiting for instructions, for an order. The realization sat like a stone in his gut. After settling the horse, he walked to the cabin and pushed the door open. "Go on in," he said, his voice rusty from disuse. She hesitated, then slipped past him into the single room. It was sparse but clean. A stone fireplace dominated one wall. A rough-hewn table with 2 chairs sat in the center. A narrow bed was tucked into one corner, and a small cot was folded against the opposite wall. A few shelves held his meager provisions. He lit the lantern on the table, and the room filled with a warm, flickering glow. He watched her take it all in, her expression unreadable. He felt the need to explain, to set things straight, but the words wouldn't come. What could he say? "I did this because I couldn't stand to see them laugh. I did this because you looked like you'd forgotten what it was to be seen as a person." It all sounded foolish and self-serving in his head. So he did the only thing he knew how to do. He went about his chores. He started a fire in the hearth, the crackle of the kindling breaking the heavy silence. He put a pot of water on to boil for coffee and pulled out some leftover stew from the night before to warm. He moved with an economy of motion born of long habit and solitude. He gestured to the cot. "That's for you," he managed to say, the words feeling clumsy in his mouth. She looked from the cot to the larger bed, a flicker of confusion in her eyes. He felt another flush of shame. Of course, she would expect to share his bed. That was part of the bond, part of the purchase. The thought made him feel sick. "No," he said, more forcefully than he intended. He saw her flinch again and cursed himself internally. He softened his voice, speaking slowly, as if to a spooked horse. "You sleep there. I sleep here." He pointed to the bed, then back to the cot. Separate. Understanding dawned on her face, followed by a wave of something else. Relief? Disbelief? He couldn't be sure. She gave that same short, formal bow and moved to the cot, setting it up without a word. They ate the stew in silence. He was acutely aware of every sound. The scrape of his spoon against his bowl, the crackle of the fire, the whisper of the wind outside. He had shared this cabin with silence for so long it had become a part of the walls. Now, her presence made the silence different. It was no longer empty. It was filled with unspoken questions. After they ate, she gathered the bowls. Before he could stop her, she was at the wash basin, cleaning them with a thoroughness that suggested it was a deeply ingrained duty. He wanted to tell her to stop, to rest, but he didn't know how. He had bought her bond. He had married her. What were the rules now? He didn't know. He suspected she didn't either. They were two strangers, marooned together by an act of pride, trying to navigate a new and treacherous landscape. Later, as he lay in his own bed, staring at the familiar patterns of water stains on the ceiling, he could hear the soft sound of her breathing from the other side of the room. It was a small, steady rhythm that was entirely foreign. He had acted on instinct, on a moment of pure, righteous anger. Now, in the dark, the consequences of that act settled in. He hadn't just bought a bondswoman. He had brought a life into his own. And as the wind howled its lonely song around the corners of the cabin, Jedediah Stone felt a profound and terrifying sense of responsibility. He had no idea what to do next. The first week passed in a state of strained, silent choreography. Jedediah rose before dawn, as he always had, and found she was already awake. The first morning, he'd woken to the smell of coffee and a small fire already crackling in the hearth. She was nowhere to be seen. He'd found her outside, feeding the chickens with a quiet focus, as if she'd been doing it her whole life. She had simply observed his routine the day before and inserted herself into it, seamlessly and silently. He tried to establish a boundary, a sense of fairness. "You don't have to do all that," he'd said one morning, gesturing toward the wood she was splitting with a small axe, a task he always did himself. She paused, the axe held loosely in her small hands, and looked at him. She didn't seem to understand his words, or perhaps she didn't believe them. She simply nodded, waited for him to turn his back, and then resumed the rhythmic thwack of the axe against the wood. It was frustrating. He felt like a man trying to reason with a shadow. She worked from sunup to sundown, mending his worn shirts with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible, tending the struggling garden with a patience he'd never possessed, and preparing meals from their meager supplies that were somehow more flavorful than anything he'd ever cooked for himself. He learned her name was May. He'd found her tracing the character for it in the dust on the porch one afternoon. He'd pointed to it, then to her. "May," he'd asked. She'd looked up, startled, then nodded, a faint blush on her cheeks. She pointed to him. "Jedediah," he said. He pointed to himself again. "Jed, Jed," she repeated softly, the sound foreign on her tongue. It was the first word he'd heard her speak, and it felt like a monumental event. Their communication became a clumsy pigeon of gestures, single words, and shared understanding born of proximity. He learned that a certain tilt of her head meant she was confused, a slight downturn of her lips meant disapproval, usually of the state of his tools, and a quick, efficient nod was her highest form of praise. She, in turn, learned that his gruff silences were not anger, that the set of his jaw meant he was worried about the lack of rain, and that when he rubbed the back of his neck, he was tired to the bone. One evening, a storm rolled in, a violent, sudden squall that threw sheets of rain against the cabin and made the windows rattle. A crack of thunder, sharp and close, shook the very foundations of the small building. Jedediah saw May flinch violently, her hands flying to her ears, her eyes squeezed shut. She curled into herself on her cot, a tremor running through her small frame. He saw raw, unfiltered terror on her face, a fear that went beyond a simple storm. It was the memory of something else. Without thinking, he crossed the room and knelt by her cot. He didn't touch her. He just stayed there, a solid presence in the flickering lamplight, until the worst of the storm passed and her trembling subsided. He said nothing, and she offered no explanation. But in the shared space of that fear, a fragile thread of connection was spun. He had seen a glimpse of the vulnerability she kept so carefully hidden, and she had seen that he would not use it against her. The first real test of their new reality came 2 weeks after her arrival. They were running low on flour and coffee, and a trip to town was unavoidable. Jedediah dreaded it. He knew what awaited them. The whispers, the stares, the open mockery of men like Croft. He considered going alone, but the thought of leaving May at the ranch, isolated and unprotected, felt wrong. What if someone came out here? What if Croft, nursing his wounded pride, decided to pay a visit? "We're going to town," he told her that morning, using a gesture toward the distant mountains that hid Redemption Gulch. A shadow passed over her face, but she nodded and prepared herself, putting on the same simple, clean clothes she'd arrived in. The ride was as silent as their first journey, but the silence was different now. It was charged with a shared apprehension. Redemption Gulch was just as he'd expected. As they rode down the main street, windows parted. People stopped on the boardwalk to stare. He heard a woman's sharp, stage-whispered comment. There he is. With her, he felt May shrink behind him, trying to make herself smaller, invisible. A hot, protective anger surged through Jedediah. He straightened his back, met the stares with a hard glare of his own, and kept his horse moving at a steady, deliberate pace. They tied Bess in front of Abernathy's mercantile. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of pickles, leather, and judgment. Mrs. Abernathy, a woman with a face perpetually soured, pursed her lips and pointedly ignored May, speaking only to Jedediah. "Flour, salt, coffee," he said, his voice flat. As Mrs. Abernathy measured out the flour, the bell over the door jingled. Silas Croft and 2 of his ranch hands swaggered in. Croft's eyes landed on them immediately, a cruel, satisfied smirk spreading across his face. Well, look what the cat dragged in," Croft drawled, loud enough for the entire store to hear. "The happy couple. How's married life treating you, Stone? Did you learn to use chopsticks yet?" His men snickered. Jedediah felt May's hand clutch the back of his shirt, a small, desperate gesture. He put his own hand over hers, a silent message of reassurance. "We're just getting our supplies, Croft," Jedediah said, keeping his voice even. "We don't want any trouble." "Trouble?" Croft said, taking a step closer. He leered at May, his gaze roaming over her in a way that made Jedediah's blood run cold. "I don't see any trouble. I see a pretty little thing. Wonder what Abernathy sold her for. Maybe you'd be willing to trade? I've got a lame horse I'm looking to get rid of." That was it. The line had been crossed. The carefully constructed dam of Jedediah's control broke. He moved so fast Croft didn't have time to react. He didn't throw a punch. He simply grabbed the front of Croft's expensive vest, bunching the material in his fist, and slammed him back against a barrel of nails. The contents rattled loudly in the sudden, shocked silence of the store. Jedediah's face was inches from Croft's. "Her name," he growled, his voice a low, dangerous thing, "is May. She is my wife. And if you ever speak to her, or look at her, like that again, the only thing you'll be trading is your teeth for a mouthful of dirt." Croft's face had gone pale, his bravado vanishing in the face of Jedediah's cold fury. He stared into Jedediah's eyes and saw no bluff, no posturing. He saw the promise of violence, swift and absolute. I was just joking," Croft stammered. "I'm not," Jedediah said. He held him there for a beat longer, making sure the message was received not just by Croft, but by everyone in the store. Then he released him with a shove. Croft stumbled back, straightening his vest, his face a mask of humiliation and rage. Jedediah turned, threw his money on the counter, grabbed his supplies, and took May's arm. "Let's go," he said softly. He led her out of the store, leaving a stunned silence and the burning glare of Silas Croft behind them. The ride home was quiet again, but the air in the space between them had changed forever. He had defended her. Not her bond, not his property, but her. He had given her a name and a place at his side, and he had drawn a line in the sand for the whole town to see. He risked a glance at her. She was looking at him, her dark eyes filled with a complex mixture of emotions he couldn't begin to decipher. But for the first time, he thought he saw something that looked like trust. He had gone to town dreading a confrontation, but he rode away from it feeling something he hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of purpose. He wasn't just a man on a failing ranch anymore. He was a husband, and he would protect his wife. The confrontation in town solidified something between them. It was no longer an arrangement born of mockery. It was a partnership forged in defiance. The silence in the cabin became less about awkwardness and more about a shared, quiet understanding. They worked together, moving in a rhythm that no longer required words. When he mended a fence, she was there with the next post before he had to ask. When she worked in the garden, he made sure the water barrel was full without being prompted. They were a team, bound by the hostile world outside their small valley. Jedediah found himself watching her. He noticed the way her brow furrowed in concentration when she was sewing, the small, secret smile that touched her lips when one of the chickens did something foolish, the grace in her movements as she swept the cabin floor. She was a woman of immense strength and quiet dignity, and he began to feel a deep, aching respect for her. It was a feeling that slowly, imperceptibly, began to curdle into something warmer, something more dangerous. He started finding small ways to bridge the gap between them. One day, he came back from checking his traps with a handful of wildflowers, their colors vibrant against the drab landscape. He felt like a fool, a grown man holding a bunch of weeds. He almost threw them away, but he pushed open the cabin door and held them out to her. She stared at the flowers, then at him, her eyes wide with surprise. She took them from his hand, her fingers brushing his, sending a jolt through him. She didn't have a vase, so she put them in a tin cup of water and set them on the table. The splash of color brightened the entire room. All evening, he caught her glancing at them, a soft light in her eyes he'd never seen before. Another time, he noticed her struggling to reach a high shelf. The next day, he built her a small footstool, sanding the wood smooth so it wouldn't give her splinters. He left it by the shelves without a word. That evening, she had prepared a dish he'd never tasted before, a savory rice porridge with wild herbs she'd gathered. It was delicious, a taste of a world he knew nothing about. It was her way of saying thank you. Their language barrier was still a formidable wall, but they found ways to chip away at it. He would point to objects and say the English word. Table, he'd say, tapping it. Lobly, she would repeat, her pronunciation careful. She, in turn, would teach him the names for things in her own tongue, her voice soft as she corrected his clumsy attempts. They were small moments, but they were building a bridge, plank by plank, across the chasm of their different worlds. But the world outside their valley had not forgotten them. The peace they were building was fragile, and they both knew it. Jedediah's debt at the bank was a constant worry, a threat that loomed larger with every passing week of scarce rain. He knew Croft had influence with the banker, Mr. Harrison, and he suspected Croft was using it to squeeze him. The threat became tangible one hot afternoon when the town preacher, Reverend Michael, rode out to the ranch. He was a tall, severe man who believed his righteousness gave him license to meddle in the lives of his flock. He dismounted, his face a grim mask of disapproval as he surveyed the small homestead. "Mr. Stone," he said, his voice devoid of warmth. May had retreated into the cabin at the sight of him, a ghost vanishing into the shadows. "Reverend," Jedediah acknowledged, his tone wary. He continued sharpening his axe, not giving the preacher the satisfaction of his full attention. "I have come on a matter of some spiritual urgency," the Reverend began, launching into a rehearsed speech. "The town is concerned. Your arrangement with this woman. It was born of mockery and drink. It is not a sanctified union in the eyes of God or this community. It's a legal document, signed by the judge," Jedediah said, his voice flat. The rhythmic scrape of the whetstone against the axe blade was the only other sound. "A piece of paper signed in a saloon does not make a marriage," the Reverend insisted, his voice rising. "You are living in sin. You are setting a terrible example. You are harboring a heathen who has not been baptized, who does not know the ways of the Lord." Jedediah stopped sharpening the axe. He looked up, his eyes cold. She is a better person than most of the hypocrites who sit in your pews every Sunday, Reverend. She is kind, and she works harder than any three of them. The Reverend flushed, taken aback by Jedediah's directness. That is not the point. The community will not stand for it. There are rules. There is decency. Mr. Croft has expressed his deep concern for the moral fabric of our town. Croft. Jedediah spat the name like something foul. Croft is concerned with his own pride, nothing more. You're his mouthpiece, Reverend. You should be ashamed. I am here to save your soul, Mr. Stone, and to protect this town from moral decay. The preacher thundered. You must put this woman aside. Send her away. We will find a suitable place for her. A Christian family who can guide her. The implication was clear. They would take her from him. They would see her bond transferred to someone else, someone suitable, like Croft. The thought of May back in that world, under the thumb of a man like that, sent a wave of ice-cold fury through Jedediah. This cabin, this small patch of hard land, had become her sanctuary. He had, however accidentally, become her protector. The idea of failing in that duty was unbearable. You listen to me, Reverend, Jedediah said, standing up to his full height, the axe held loosely in his hand. He wasn't threatening the man, but his presence was formidable. May is my wife. This is her home. And you, and Croft, and the rest of your concerned town will stay away from her. You are not welcome here. Now get off my land. The Reverend, seeing the absolute, unyielding resolve in Jedediah's eyes, sputtered for a moment, then turned on his heel without another word. He mounted his horse and rode away in a cloud of righteous indignation. Jedediah watched him go, his heart pounding in his chest. He had won the skirmish, but he knew the war was coming. The preacher's visit was a declaration. They wouldn't let it go. They would use the law, the bank, the church, every tool at their disposal, to break them apart. He turned and went back into the cabin. May was standing by the cold hearth, her hands clenched together. She had heard it all. The fear was back in her eyes, stark and raw. She looked at him, her expression a silent question. What now? He walked over to her, his mind racing. The marriage certificate from the saloon was a flimsy shield. They needed something more, something undeniable. He had to make their union real, not just in their hearts, but in the eyes of the very world that sought to tear them apart. He stopped in front of her. He didn't know the words for what he was feeling, this fierce, protective thing that felt so much like love it scared him. He reached out and gently took her hand. Her skin was cool, her fingers trembled slightly in his. May, he said, his voice rough with emotion. We need to make it real. He pointed from himself to her, then made a circle with his finger, a symbol of a ring, of permanence. He then pointed toward town, toward the church where the disapproving reverend preached. He was proposing, not in a saloon as a joke, but here, in their home, as a promise to stand with her against everyone. She looked at his hand holding hers, then up into his eyes. He saw the fear warring with a fragile, burgeoning hope. She had been bought and sold, treated as less than human. A real marriage, a real choice, was something she probably never dared to dream of. He watched as the hope won. A single tear traced a path through the dust on her cheek. She didn't smile, but she squeezed his hand. And then, she nodded. It was a declaration of their own. They would face the town not as a man and his bondswoman, but as husband and wife. And they would do it together. The preacher's visit had changed everything. It had transformed an unspoken threat into an imminent danger. Jedediah knew Croft wouldn't stop at sending the town's moral guardian. The next attack would be more direct, aimed at the foundation of Jedediah's life, his ranch. A few days later, a letter arrived, delivered by a boy on a pony. It was from the bank in Redemption Gulch. The formal, looping script of Mr. Harrison, the bank president, informed Jedediah that due to the ongoing drought and his failure to make a substantial payment, the bank was forced to review the terms of his loan. They were calling for a meeting in 1 week's time to discuss the impending foreclosure. Jedediah read the letter twice, his gut clenching tighter with each word. He'd always been behind, always struggled to make ends meet. But Harrison had been patient before, extending him credit based on the promise of a good harvest. But there was no good harvest this year. The drought had seen to that. And Jedediah knew, with a certainty that settled like ice in his veins, that Silas Croft's influence was behind this sudden pressure. Croft was a major depositor at the bank. A word from him would be all it took to turn Harrison from a patient creditor into a vulture. He looked up from the letter at May. She was watching him, her dark eyes filled with concern. She couldn't read the words, but she could read the despair on his face. He held out the paper to her. She took it, her brow furrowing as she looked at the official letterhead. Bank, he said, the word tasting like ash. They want the ranch. He made a sweeping gesture with his hand, encompassing the cabin, the barn, the very land they stood on. Then he made a gesture of something being taken away. Her eyes widened in understanding. This place, their sanctuary, was under threat. He saw the fear in her expression, but it was quickly replaced by something else, resolve. She put the letter down on the table and placed her small hand over his large, calloused one. It was a simple gesture, but it spoke volumes. We are in this together. That night, sleep offered no escape for Jedediah. He tossed and turned, his mind a maelstrom of worry. Losing the ranch was more than losing property. It was losing his history, his connection to his father and grandfather. It was losing the only home he had ever known. And now, it was losing the only home May had known where she was treated with kindness. If they were forced off the land, they would have nothing. They would be vulnerable, and Croft would be waiting. He would find a way to claim her bond, to take her. The thought was a physical torment. He rose before dawn, unable to lie in bed any longer. He went outside and stared at the pale, pre-dawn sky. The stars were fading. A cool breeze whispered through the pines. He felt trapped, a bull in a pen with the gates slowly closing. What could he do? He had no money. He had no allies in town. He heard a soft footstep behind him. It was May, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders against the morning chill. She stood beside him, her presence a quiet comfort in the vast, indifferent landscape. She pointed to the east, where the first hint of light was beginning to stain the horizon. Then she pointed to her own chest, then to his. Finally, she pointed to the cabin. Her meaning was clear, a message that transcended their broken language. The sun would rise. We are here. This is our home. It was a statement of resilience, not of despair. Her quiet strength shamed his panic. He was so focused on what they could lose that he'd forgotten what they had. They had each other. They had a resolve forged in shared hardship. You're right, he said softly, more to himself than to her. A new plan began to form in his mind, desperate and bold. The bank wanted to foreclose. The preacher wanted to condemn them. Croft wanted to destroy them. They were all hiding behind veils of legality and morality. The only way to fight back was to tear those veils away, to force a confrontation in the open. He spent the next few days in a fever of activity. He gathered every receipt he had, every document related to the ranch. He found his parents' marriage certificate, a faded document from the circuit preacher who had married them in this very cabin 35 years ago. It felt like a talisman, a connection to a legitimate past. He also had a conversation with May. It was the most difficult and important one of their lives. He used gestures, drawings in the dirt, and the few words they shared. He explained his plan. They would go to town on the day of his meeting with the bank. But they wouldn't just go to the bank. They would go to the church first. They would stand before the town and demand the reverend marry them properly, with witnesses. They would challenge the town's hypocrisy head-on. It was a tremendous risk. They could be laughed out of town, or worse. He needed to know if she was willing to face that. He tried to explain the danger, the humiliation they might face. He gave her a choice. He drew a picture of her, and a road leading away from the ranch, away from him. He was offering her an out. She could leave. He would not stop her. It was the only fair thing to do. May looked at his crude drawing for a long time. She then picked up the stick and, with a steady hand, she rubbed out the road leading away. She then drew a line connecting the figure of her to the figure of him, and then drew a circle around them both, enclosing them together with the drawing of the cabin. She looked up at him, her eyes fierce and clear. There was no fear left. There was only determination. In that moment, Jedediah's heart, a thing he'd thought long since hardened and closed off, cracked wide open. This wasn't about responsibility anymore. It wasn't about defiance. He was in love with this brave, quiet woman. The realization was both terrifying and liberating. It gave him the final piece of strength he needed. He was no longer fighting for his land. He was fighting for their life together. The night before the bank meeting, A profound quiet settled over the cabin. It wasn't the silence of strangers, nor the silence of apprehension. It was the calm at the center of a storm. They ate their meal, the wildflowers in the tin cup now wilted, but still a reminder of the first small bridge built between them. After they had cleaned up, May did something she had never done before. She took a small, cloth-wrapped bundle from her few belongings. She unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a tunic of deep red silk, intricately embroidered with golden threads depicting a phoenix. It was beautiful, a piece of art that seemed impossibly vibrant in their rustic cabin. He realized it must be her wedding tunic, a treasure she had somehow managed to keep through all her hardships. She held it up, then looked at him, a question in her eyes. She was asking if she should wear it tomorrow. She was offering to bring the most sacred piece of her old life into their new one. Jedediah felt a lump form in his throat. He reached out and touched the smooth silk, his rough fingers tracing the path of a golden feather. "Yes," he whispered, his voice thick. "It's beautiful." She folded it carefully, a rare, true smile finally reaching her eyes. It transformed her face, lighting it from within. And Jedediah knew, with absolute certainty, that no matter what happened tomorrow, he had already won the only thing that truly mattered. He had found his heart in the most unexpected place imaginable, and he would fight for it with everything he had. The morning of the confrontation dawned clear and bright, the sky a pitiless, polished blue. The air was still, holding the heat of the day to come. Jedediah and May moved with a quiet, focused purpose. He dressed in his only clean shirt and trousers, clothes usually reserved for funerals and Christmases he no longer celebrated. He brushed the dust from his worn boots and his father's old hat. When he was ready, he turned to see May. She stood in the center of the room, bathed in the morning light streaming through the single window. The red silk of her tunic was a slash of brilliant, defiant color in the drab cabin. The golden phoenix seemed to shimmer, its wings spread as if in flight. Her black hair was intricately braided and pinned, and for the first time, she had left her face free of the curtain of hair she often used as a shield. She looked not like a bondswoman, but like a queen. She was breathtaking. He could only stare, the words lodged in his throat. She met his gaze, and in her eyes, he saw the same mixture of fear and resolve that churned in his own gut. He walked over to her and held out his hand. She placed hers in it. Her hand was small and cool in his, a perfect fit. Together, without a word, they walked out the door and into the day that would decide their future. The ride to Redemption Gulch felt different from all the others. They rode side by side, Jedediah on Bess and May on a gentle mare he'd borrowed from a neighbor in the next valley, one of the few men who had shown him any kindness over the years. They didn't huddle or hide. They rode with their heads held high, a silent, united front. As they approached the town, they could feel the atmosphere shift. Word of the bank meeting, and likely of the preacher's visit, had spread. People stopped to watch them pass, their faces a mixture of curiosity, scorn, and grudging respect. Jedediah ignored them all. His focus was on the church steeple that rose above the false-fronted buildings, and on the woman riding beside him. Their first stop was not the bank. As planned, they dismounted in front of the white-painted church. Its doors were closed. It was a weekday, and there was no service scheduled. But Jedediah knew the Reverend would be in his office in the back. A small crowd began to gather at a respectful distance, drawn by the unusual sight of the town's pariahs on the church steps. Jedediah hammered on the heavy oak door. After a moment, it opened a crack, and Reverend Michael's face appeared, his expression souring as he saw who it was. "Stone, I told you. We're here to be married, Reverend." Jedediah cut him off, his voice ringing with authority in the quiet street. "Properly. In your church. Before God in this town." The Reverend's face paled, then flushed with anger. "This is absurd. I will not be a party to this mockery." "It's not a mockery," Jedediah said, his voice dropping lower, more intense. "It's a marriage, and you are a man of God. It is your duty to sanctify it. Or are you just a mouthpiece for men like Silas Croft?" From across the street, a familiar, sneering voice cut through the air. "He's right, preacher. It is a mockery." Silas Croft strode toward them, a confident smirk on his face. He'd clearly been waiting for them. The bank president, Mr. Harrison, scurried along in his wake, looking uncomfortable. The sheriff, A weary man named Miller, who usually tried to stay out of town politics, followed a few paces behind. Croft had assembled his allies. The showdown had begun. "You're a day late for your own wedding, Stone," Croft crowed, stopping at the bottom of the church steps, playing to the growing crowd. "But you're just in time for your own eviction. Mr. Harrison has some papers for you." Harrison stepped forward reluctantly, holding a folder. "Jedediah, the board has met. I'm afraid the bank is foreclosing on your property. Effective immediately." The crowd gasped. This was more than gossip. This was a public execution. Jedediah felt May's hand tighten on his arm, but her posture remained unwavering. "You see, Stone," Croft said, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "You have nothing. The land is gone. And this arrangement," he gestured dismissively at May. "Her bond was indentured to the owner of the Stone Ranch. Since you are no longer the owner, her bond reverts to the bank, to be sold to cover your debts." He smiled, a predator's grin. "And I, as a concerned citizen, have already made the bank a generous offer for her contract." The trap was sprung. It was perfectly legal, perfectly cruel. He would lose his home, and he would lose her, all in one public, humiliating blow. The crowd murmured, their sympathies, fickle as they were, now clearly against him. He was a loser, a failure. Jedediah looked at Croft's triumphant face, at the preacher's smug righteousness, at Harrison's averted eyes. He felt a moment of pure, black despair. They had him. They had won. Then he felt a gentle tug on his sleeve. He looked down at May. She had stepped forward slightly, positioning herself beside him, not behind him. She looked not at him, but directly at the crowd. Her face was calm, her dignity a shield. And in that moment, something inside Jedediah shifted. He was not a failure. He was a man who had been loved by this woman. And that was a victory no one could take from him. He found his voice, and it was not the voice of a defeated man. "You think this is about land?" he said, his voice quiet but carrying in the tense silence. "You think it's about debt?" He looked from face to face in the crowd, the people who had mocked him, judged him, and now watched him be destroyed. "You've all seen me my whole life. You know me. I'm a quiet man. I keep to myself. But you don't know her." He turned to May, his gaze softening. "This is May. And you're right. She was a bondswoman. She came to this country and has known nothing but hardship and cruelty. She has been treated like an animal, like property. Less than property." He then looked back at Croft, his eyes blazing with a fire that made the other man take an involuntary step back. "And men like you, Croft, you see her, and all you see is something to be used, something to be bought and sold to prove your own power. You, Reverend, you see a heathen to be saved or cast out. And you, Mr. Harrison, you see an asset on a ledger." He paused, letting his words sink in. "But I see a woman of more strength and honor than any of you will ever know. I've seen her work until her hands bled without complaint. I've seen her create beauty from nothing. And I've seen her show kindness in a world that has shown her none." He reached into his pocket and pulled out the crumpled, whiskey-stained marriage certificate from the saloon. He held it up. "You call this a mockery. Maybe it started as one, but it has become the truest thing in my life." He turned to May, taking both of her hands in his. "I love this woman," he declared, the words feeling powerful and right. "And this paper says she is my wife. The law you hide behind, Sheriff, says a man's wife is not property to be seized for his debts. She is his family." Sheriff Miller, who had been watching the exchange with a thoughtful expression, stepped forward. "He's right, Silas. The document is legal. She's his wife, not his chattel. She can't be part of the foreclosure." Croft's face turned purple with rage. "That's ridiculous. It was a joke. The whole town knows it. A joke that's signed and sealed by a judge," Miller said, his voice firm. He was tired of Croft's bullying. He was a lawman, and for the first time in a long time, he felt compelled to uphold the spirit of the law, not just the letter as interpreted by the town's richest bully. It was then that May did something no one expected. She stepped forward, letting go of Jedediah's hands. She addressed the crowd, her voice soft but clear, her English broken but filled with a power that commanded their attention. "I was property," she said, holding up her hands, showing them faint, silvery scars on her wrists. "My life was work. And fear. No one see me. Only my hands." She lowered her hands and looked at Jedediah. "This man," she said, her voice trembling slightly but gaining strength. He see me. He give me home. He give me flour. A few people in the crowd shifted uncomfortably. He is my husband. My family. She looked at the Reverend. God is here, she said, placing a hand on her heart. Not just in building. A hush fell over the street. Her simple, heartfelt words had done more to shame them than all of Jedediah's angry defiance. They had seen her for weeks as an object, a curiosity. Now, for the first time, they saw her as a person. A woman who had suffered, and who had found a sliver of kindness in an unlikely place. Jedediah Stone stood beside his wife, his heart full to bursting. He had lost his ranch. He was about to be homeless. But as he looked at May, standing tall and proud in her beautiful red tunic, he knew he had never been richer. The ranch is yours, Croft, Jedediah said, his voice ringing with a strange kind of freedom. A man doesn't need land to have a home. He put his arm around May's shoulders, drawing her close. We'll be leaving. They turned their backs on the stunned crowd, on the fuming Silas Croft and the flustered preacher. They had lost the battle for the land, but they had won the war for their dignity, for their right to be a family. As they walked toward their horses, a unified front against the world, they had never been more powerful. The walk to their horses was the longest walk of Jedediah's life. Every step felt heavy, a final farewell to the town that had been the only backdrop he'd ever known. He could feel the eyes of the crowd on his back, a mixture of pity, confusion, and for the first time from some, a sliver of respect. Croft had his victory, the deed to a piece of land, but Jedediah had May's hand in his. It was no contest. They mounted their horses. He looked at his wife, her face serene despite the ruin of their plans. He gave her a small, weary smile, and she returned it with a look of such profound trust and love that it mended the broken pieces of his spirit. He turned his horse, not back the way they came, but toward the open country, toward an unknown future. They hadn't gotten far down the dusty street when a voice called out, "Hold on there, Stone." It was Sheriff Miller, hurrying to catch up to them. Jedediah reined in his horse, his body tensing, expecting one final blow. The sheriff came to a stop beside them, breathing a little heavily. He took off his hat and wiped his brow. "That was quite a thing back there," he said, looking from Jedediah to May with a new expression in his eyes. "Takes a lot of sand to stand up to Croft like that." "He can have the ranch," Jedediah said, his voice flat. "We just want to be left alone." "About that," Miller said, scratching the back of his neck. "I've been doing some thinking. And some reading. The Homestead Act. And the timber laws." He looked Jedediah straight in the eye. "The valley where your ranch is, your father only ever filed a claim on the bottom land, the 160 acres with the water rights. But all that timber up on the North Ridge, that's federal land. Unclaimed." Jedediah stared at him, not daring to hope. "What are you saying, Sheriff?" "I'm saying," Miller went on, a slow grin spreading across his face, "that Silas Croft just bought himself 160 acres of dusty bottom land that's damn near worthless without access to the timber on the ridge. And according to the land office maps I checked last month, the only road to that timber runs right through a 40-acre parcel that's also unclaimed." He let the words hang in the air. A man could file a claim on that parcel, build a new cabin. He'd control the only way in or out of that whole valley. He could charge a timber toll. A man could make a decent living. The implication was staggering. Croft had bought the ranch, but Jedediah could still control the valley. He could start over. He could build them a new home. "Why?" Jedediah asked, his voice hoarse. "Why are you telling me this?" The sheriff looked over at May, who was listening with a rapt, uncomprehending expression. "Let's just say I got tired of watching bullies win," he said quietly. "And my wife always said your father was a good man. Besides," he added, his grin widening, "I can't wait to see the look on Croft's face when he finds out he bought a prison he can't get out of." He clapped his hat back on his head. "The land office is 2 towns over. If you ride hard, you can be there by tomorrow and file the claim before Croft even knows what hit him. Now get going." With a nod, the sheriff turned and walked back toward his office, leaving Jedediah and May sitting on their horses in the middle of the street, the world having just tilted back on its axis. Jedediah looked at May, a slow, disbelieving smile spreading across his face. He tried to explain with gestures, drawing a new house in the air, a line for a road, a symbol for money. He wasn't sure if she understood the details, but she understood the look on his face. She saw the hope that had returned to his eyes, brighter than before. They didn't go back to the ranch. There was nothing for them there now but ghosts. They turned their horses and rode, not aimlessly into the wilderness, but with a new purpose, a new destination. The resolution in the aftermath was quiet. They filed the claim. They spent a few weeks living in a lean-to on their new 40 acres, a piece of land higher up the valley, overlooking what had once been Jedediah's home. From their vantage point, they could see the dust kicked up by Croft's frustrated cattle, unable to get to the high summer pastures without crossing their land. The victory was silent, but it was absolute. Slowly, with his own 2 hands, Jedediah began to build their new home. It was smaller than the old cabin, but it was theirs. May worked beside him, chinking the logs with a mixture of mud and grass, tending a new garden carved out of the mountainside. The town, for the most part, left them alone. The story of their stand on the church steps had become a local legend, and public opinion had quietly turned against Croft, whose bitterness had soured his standing in the community. One evening, as the sun set, casting long shadows across the valley, Jedediah and May sat on the porch of their half-finished cabin. He was carving a piece of wood, and she was mending one of his shirts. A comfortable silence stretched between them, filled now with the chirping of crickets and the scent of pine. This new home wasn't built on a legacy of dirt and struggle, but on a foundation of shared courage. May finished her mending. Instead of putting the shirt away, she held it, her fingers tracing a new pattern she had stitched over the heart. It was a small, intricate flower, a wildflower like the ones he had first given her. It was a mark of belonging, a quiet declaration. He stopped his carving and looked at her, his heart aching with a love so fierce and profound it left him breathless. He had been mocked into a wedding, a joke meant to shame him. He had faced down his enemies and lost everything he thought he valued. But in losing it all, he had found the only thing that mattered. He reached across the small space between them and took her hand. Her fingers curled around his, a familiar, comforting weight. He didn't need to say the words. She could see it in his eyes, feel it in his touch. He wasn't her protector anymore, not just. He was her husband. And she, in her quiet, unyielding strength, was the fierce love that defended him right back. He looked out at the valley below, at the lights of his old life, and felt no regret. He looked at the woman beside him, her face bathed in the soft alpenglow, and knew he was finally, truly home.